This 1899 portrait looked peaceful, until experts noticed who was standing behind the chair. Rebecca Torres adjusted her laptop screen, squinting at the high-resolution scan of the photograph she had just acquired. As a curator specializing in 19th century American photography at the Boston Historical Society, she had seen thousands of family portraits from the Victorian era. Most followed predictable patterns: stiff poses, formal clothing, carefully arranged compositions designed to project wealth and respectability. This particular photograph, purchased from an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina, seemed entirely typical at first glance. The image showed a prosperous white family from 1899. The father, a stern-looking man in his mid-40s, sat in an ornate carved wooden chair with velvet upholstery. His wife stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, wearing an elaborate dress with lace trim and a high collar. Their 3 children were arranged around them, 2 daughters in white dresses with ribbons in their hair, and a teenage son in a dark suit. The setting was clearly a professional photography studio, with a painted backdrop depicting classical columns and draped fabric. Everything about the composition spoke of careful staging and social performance. The family's clothing was expensive, their posture rigidly formal. The photographer had positioned them to emphasize the father's centrality as the patriarch around whom everyone else oriented themselves. It was a portrait designed to communicate stability, prosperity, and proper Victorian values. Rebecca had purchased the photograph, along with several others from the estate of the family's last descendant, an elderly woman named Margaret Whitmore, who had died without children. The estate sale had included furniture, paintings, books, and boxes of family documents and photographs dating back to the 1850s. Rebecca had been particularly interested in the photographic collection, which documented a prominent Charleston merchant family across several generations. She had spent the past week cataloging the items, creating detailed descriptions for the Society's database. This particular photograph was labeled on the back in faded ink: Whitmore Family Portrait, Charleston, March 1899. Rebecca entered this information into her database and was about to move on to the next item when something caught her attention. She zoomed in on the image, examining the area around the father's chair more closely. The photograph was remarkably clear for its age, with excellent contrast and sharp detail. As she enlarged the lower portion of the image, focusing on the space just behind Charles Whitmore's chair, Rebecca noticed something unusual. At first, she thought it was a shadow or perhaps part of the chair's carved decoration, but as she adjusted the brightness and contrast of the digital image, the shape became more distinct. It was a hand, a dark-skinned woman's hand, positioned low near the floor, partially obscured by shadow and fabric. And on the 4th finger was a distinctive wide ring with an engraved pattern that seemed to shimmer, even in the sepia tones of the photograph. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she stared at the hand. It was positioned low, near the floor, partially obscured by the shadow cast by the chair and by the draping of Sarah Whitmore's voluminous skirt. The hand was clearly visible once you knew to look for it, yet easy to miss in the overall composition of the photograph. The contrast between the dark skin and the pale hands of the Whitmore family members was stark and undeniable, but what truly captured Rebecca's attention was the ring. Even in the sepia tones of the photograph, she could see that it was distinctive, a wide band with what appeared to be an engraved or carved pattern. She zoomed in further, making the image as large as possible without losing clarity. The ring's design became slightly more visible. It looked like it might have African or Caribbean motifs, though she couldn't be certain from the photograph alone. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Someone else had been present during this formal family portrait, someone who had been positioned, or forced to position herself, behind the father's chair, hidden from view but not quite invisible. The hand's placement suggested the person was crouching or kneeling, making themselves as small and unobtrusive as possible. She immediately thought of the domestic servants who would have been part of any wealthy Southern household in 1889. By that time, slavery had been abolished for 34 years, but the social and economic structures that had replaced it often maintained similar hierarchies and power dynamics. Black women worked as domestic servants in white households throughout the South, their labor essential, but their presence often rendered invisible in family narratives and historical records. But why would someone be hidden behind the chair during a formal family portrait? And why was that hand visible at all? Had it been an accident, an unintended inclusion that the photographer and family had simply not noticed? Or was there something more deliberate at play? Rebecca printed out an enlarged image of just the hand and ring, studying it under a magnifying glass. The ring's band was substantial, not delicate like the jewelry worn by the Whitmore women in the photograph. The engraved pattern, while difficult to see clearly, suggested intentional artistry rather than simple decoration. She knew that jewelry often held deep personal and cultural significance, especially for people whose histories had been marked by displacement and trauma. For enslaved people and their descendants, items that could be carried and concealed, rings, bracelets, small religious objects, became crucial links to family, heritage, and identity. A distinctive ring like this one might have been passed down through generations, might have originated in Africa, or been created by skilled artisans in the Americas. Rebecca began pulling out the other materials from the Whitmore estate, determined to find out who this woman was and why she had been forced into invisibility during what should have been a straightforward family portrait. Rebecca spent the afternoon searching through the boxes of documents from the Whitmore estate. The collection contained ledgers, correspondence, diaries, and various legal documents spanning decades. She started with the family's financial records from the 1890s, looking for any reference to household servants or employees. The ledgers showed regular payments to various tradespeople and service providers, but there was also a section labeled Household Expenses that included payments described simply as wages with no names attached. In March 1899, the same month as the photograph, there was an entry for $3.50 labeled Domestic Wages, monthly. Rebecca paused. $3.50 per month was an appallingly low wage even for that era, suggesting significant exploitation. For context, white domestic workers in northern cities were earning $10 to $15 per month at that time. The discrepancy reflected the economic oppression that black workers, especially women, faced throughout the country, but particularly in the South. She continued searching and found a diary kept by Sarah Whitmore, the mother in the photograph. The entries were sporadic and often brief, focused mainly on social events, church activities, and concerns about her children's health and education. But in February 1899, Rebecca found an entry that made her breath catch. The new girl, Rose, is proving satisfactory in her duties. She is quiet, knows her place, which is a relief after the difficulties with the previous girl who had too many opinions. Rose keeps the house clean and manages the laundry competently. She wears a curious old ring that she says belonged to her grandmother. I told her it looks heathenish, but she begged to keep it, and I suppose there is no harm in it. Rose. Rebecca now had a name, and confirmation that the ring was a treasured family heirloom, significant enough that Rose had pleaded to be allowed to keep wearing it despite her employer's disapproval and racist characterization. Rebecca searched for more references to Rose in the diary. Most were brief and utilitarian. Rose burned the bread again. Rose is ill, had to manage with Margaret's help. Gave Rose my old brown dress. But one entry from April 1899, just a month after the photograph, stopped Rebecca cold. I caught Rose looking at the new family portrait that Mr. Whitmore had framed. She seemed quite affected by it, though I cannot imagine why. It is our family, after all, not hers. I reminded her that she has work to do and should not be idle. Rebecca stared at those words. Rose had been looking at the photograph, affected by it. Of course she had been. She was in it, hidden and humiliated, forced to crouch behind the chair while the family she served posed in dignity and comfort. Rebecca's next step was to identify the photographer who had created the portrait. She examined the photograph again, looking for a photographer's mark or stamp. Many professional photographers signed their work, either on the front or back of the image. On the back of the Whitmore portrait, beneath the family's handwritten label, she found a small embossed mark. Harrison and Cover, Photographers, Charleston, SC. She immediately began researching Harrison & Co. The Charleston Historical Society's archives included business directories and advertisements from the late 19th century. She found several references to the photography studio, which had operated on King Street from 1885 until 1912. The proprietor, Edmund Harrison, had been a respected photographer who served Charleston's elite families. Rebecca contacted the Charleston Historical Society to inquire about any surviving records from Harrison's studio. To her delight, the archivist informed her that they had several boxes of materials, including appointment books and some correspondence, that had been donated by Harrison's descendants in the 1970s. Within 2 days, Rebecca was on a train to Charleston, her laptop and research notes packed carefully in her bag. The city's humid spring air enveloped her as she stepped off at the station. Charleston's historic district still bore the architectural marks of its antebellum prosperity, built on the labor of enslaved people and the wealth generated by their exploitation. The Historical Society's reading room was quiet and climate-controlled. The archivist, a middle-aged man named Robert, brought out 3 boxes of materials from Harrison's studio. Rebecca pulled on white cotton gloves and began carefully examining the appointment books from 1899. The entries were written in neat, precise handwriting. Each appointment included the client's name, the date, the type of photograph requested, and sometimes brief notes about special requirements. In March 1899, Rebecca found the entry she was looking for. March 12, 1899, Whitmore family portrait. Studio sitting, 5 subjects. Client requests formal composition emphasizing paternal authority. Payment, $5, 5 subjects. Rebecca read the line again. The notation clearly said 5 subjects, but only 4 people were visible in the photograph, Charles and Sarah Whitmore and their 3 children. The 5th subject must have been Rose. Rebecca continued searching through the records and found something even more revealing. A letter from Charles Whitmore to Edmund Harrison, dated March 8, 1899, 4 days before the sitting. The letter was brief, but chilling in its casual cruelty. Mr. Harrison, I wish to arrange a family portrait for Monday next. We shall be 5 in total, myself, my wife, and our 3 children. I also require that our housemaid be present during the sitting, positioned behind my chair. She should not be visible in the final composition, but her presence is necessary for a matter of household discipline. I trust you will accommodate this unusual request with discretion. Rebecca stared at the letter, feeling her stomach turn. A matter of household discipline. Charles Whitmore had deliberately forced Rose to crouch behind his chair during the family portrait as a punishment. The formal family photograph, meant to project respectability and unity, had been transformed into an instrument of humiliation and control. She continued reading through the materials, searching for any response from Edmund Harrison. She found a brief note in Harrison's business correspondence file. Mr. Whitmore, your request is most unusual, but I shall comply. The sitting is scheduled for Monday, March 12th at 2 p.m. I assure you of complete discretion. E. Harrison. Rebecca leaned back, processing what she had discovered. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. Rose had been deliberately included in the photograph, but forced into invisibility, made to kneel or crouch in an uncomfortable position while the Whitmore family stood in dignity. It was a calculated act of degradation, and the photographer had been complicit in it. But what had Rose done to warrant such punishment? Rebecca returned to Sarah Whitmore's diary, reading more carefully through the entries from February and early March 1899. Most were mundane, but one entry from March 5th, a week before the photograph, provided context. Rose has proven herself insolent. Yesterday, when I asked her to repolish the silver she had already cleaned, she had the audacity to suggest that the work had been done properly and did not need repeating. I was quite shocked by her tone. Charles says I'm too lenient with her and that she needs to be reminded of her place. He has devised a fitting correction that will reinforce the proper order of our household. Rebecca felt anger rising in her chest. Rose had simply defended the quality of her work, had dared to speak up when asked to perform unnecessary labor, and for this she had been subjected to deliberate humiliation. The fitting correction was forcing her to attend the family portrait in a position of subordination and invisibility. She thought about what this experience must have been like for Rose. Being forced to dress properly, to accompany the family to the photography studio, to kneel behind the chair for however long the sitting required. Victorian photography sessions could take 30 minutes or more with multiple exposures and adjustments. Rose would have had to remain perfectly still, cramped and uncomfortable, while the family she served posed above her. And then, adding insult to injury, to later see the framed photograph displayed in the house, a permanent reminder of her humiliation. No wonder Sarah had noted that Rose seemed quite affected when looking at it. Rebecca photographed all the relevant documents and made detailed notes. She was building a clear picture of Rose's experience, but she still had crucial questions. What had happened to Rose after 1899? Had she remained with the Whitmore family, or had she found a way to leave? And what was the story behind that distinctive ring, the one piece of her identity and heritage that she had fought to keep? Back in Boston, Rebecca began the painstaking work of tracing Rose through historical records. Without a last name, the search would be challenging but not impossible. She started with the 1900 federal census, taken just 1 year after the photograph. The census listed household members by name, age, race, occupation, and relationship to the head of household. Rebecca found the Whitmore family easily, Charles, Sarah, and their 3 children all living at their King Street address, but there was no Rose listed in their household. This could mean several things. Rose might have left the Whitmore household between March 1899 and the census enumeration in June 1900. She might have been temporarily elsewhere when the census taker came. Or she might have been deliberately omitted from the count, which sometimes happened with domestic workers who were considered transient. Rebecca expanded her search, looking through the census pages for the surrounding area, searching for any black woman named Rose working as a domestic servant. Charleston's black community in 1900 was substantial. The city was roughly 50% black, and domestic service was one of the few employment options available to black women in the Jim Crow South. After hours of searching, Rebecca found a possible match. Rose Freeman, age 28, black, occupation listed as laundress, living in a boarding house on Meeting Street. The age seemed right. If Rose had been in her late 20s in 1899, she would have been about 28 in 1900. Rebecca made note of the address and turned to Charleston city directories, which were published annually and listed residents by name and occupation. In the 1901 directory, she found Rose Freeman again, still listed as a laundress at the same Meeting Street address. The occupation had changed from domestic servant to laundress, suggesting that Rose had left the Whitmore household and established herself as an independent worker. This was significant. Laundry work was difficult and poorly paid, but it offered more autonomy than domestic service. Women who took in laundry worked from their own homes, set their own schedules, and didn't have to live under their employer's constant surveillance and control. For someone who had experienced the kind of humiliation Rose had endured, the independence of laundry work might have been worth the economic sacrifice. Rebecca continued tracing Rose through subsequent years. The city directories showed her at the same address through 1905, then at a different location on Cumming Street in 1906. She was still listed as a laundress, still apparently living independently. Then, in the 1908 directory, Rebecca found something interesting. Freeman, Rose, Mrs., laundress, with a notation of Freeman, Joseph, laborer, at the same address. Rose had married. She had built a life beyond the Whitmore house, had found partnership and perhaps happiness. Rebecca searched marriage records at the Charleston County Courthouse archives online. In October 1907, she found the record. Rose Freeman, age 35, married Joseph Freeman, age 38, both colored, both residing in Charleston. The marriage certificate included a detail that made Rebecca's heart race. Under distinctive marks or characteristics, the clerk had noted for Rose, wears silver ring engraved left hand. Rebecca now had confirmation that the ring in the photograph had remained with Rose throughout her life, significant enough to be noted on her marriage certificate. But where had it come from, and what did the engravings mean? She needed to find out more about Rose's family history and the ring's origins. She returned to the 1900 census entry for Rose Freeman and examined it more carefully. Under birthplace, it listed South Carolina. Under birthplace of mother, it said South Carolina, but under birthplace of father, it said Africa. This notation was rare but not unknown in census records from this period. It indicated that Rose's father had been born in Africa and brought to the United States as part of the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade to the United States had officially ended in 1808, but illegal smuggling continued for decades afterward, and some enslaved people brought to the U.S. in the early 19th century were still alive in the 1880s and 1890s. If Rose's father had been African-born, the ring might have been brought directly from Africa or created in the United States by someone with direct knowledge of African metalworking traditions. Rebecca contacted Dr. James Mitchell, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in African and African-American material culture. She sent him the enhanced images of the ring from the photograph. Dr. Mitchell called her 2 days later, his voice excited. "Rebecca, this is remarkable. The design on that ring appears to be Akan, from what is now Ghana. See those geometric patterns? They're consistent with Adinkra symbols, which carry specific meanings. I can't make out all the details from the photograph, but what I can see suggests symbols related to endurance, faith, and resistance. Could it have been made in Africa?" Rebecca asked. "Possibly," Dr. Mitchell replied, "or it could have been made here by someone from that cultural tradition. Many enslaved people from the Gold Coast region maintained their metalworking skills. Sometimes they created jewelry that carried hidden meaning, ways of preserving identity and heritage that enslavers couldn't recognize or forbid. So, this ring would have been incredibly precious to Rose," Rebecca said. "Not just as jewelry, but as a link to her father's homeland and her family's history." "Absolutely. And the fact that she fought to keep wearing it, even when her employer called it heathenish, shows tremendous courage. That ring was her resistance, her refusal to be completely erased." Rebecca thanked Dr. Mitchell and sat thinking about what the ring represented. For Rose, forced to kneel invisible behind a white family's chair, that ring had been a tangible connection to her own identity, heritage, and dignity. It was something that belonged to her and her alone, something that Sarah Whitmore's disapproval couldn't take away. She wondered if Rose had touched the ring during that long, humiliating photography session, drawing strength from its presence on her finger. Had she thought about her father? About the traditions and knowledge he had carried across the ocean? Had the ring helped her endure? Rebecca's investigation had revealed Rose's story, but she wanted to know what had happened to her in later years and whether she had descendants who might still live in Charleston. She continued tracing Rose through city directories and census records. The 1910 census showed Rose and Joseph Freeman living on Cumming Street with 2 children, a daughter named Clara, age 2, and a son named James, age 6 months. Rose's occupation was still listed as laundress, Joseph's as a dock worker. The family owned their home, a remarkable achievement for a black family in Jim Crow Charleston. Through the 1920 and 1930 censuses, Rebecca traced the family's progression. Rose and Joseph had 6 children in total. Joseph died in 1932, but Rose lived until 1951, reaching the age of 79. According to her death certificate, she had been survived by 4 of her children and numerous grandchildren. Rebecca began searching for living descendants through genealogy websites and local Charleston directories. After several false starts, she found a woman named Patricia Freeman, age 68, living in Charleston. Patricia's online family tree showed her as the great-granddaughter of Rose and Joseph Freeman. Rebecca drafted a careful email, introducing herself and explaining her research. She described the photograph and what she had learned about Rose's experience with the Whitmore family, and asked if Patricia would be willing to share any family stories or information. The response came within hours. Patricia wrote, "Dr. Torres, I am stunned by what you've discovered. My great-grandmother Rose's story was passed down in our family, but some details had been lost. We knew she had worked for a wealthy white family and that she left that position after some kind of incident, but the specifics weren't clear. We have always treasured a ring that belonged to her. It's been passed down through the women in our family. My mother has it now. The ring you saw in that photograph." Rebecca's hands trembled as she read. The ring still existed, preserved through generations, still carrying its meanings of endurance and resistance. Patricia continued, "I would very much like to meet with you and learn everything you've discovered. My mother is 91 years old, but she's sharp and would want to hear this too. Rose was her grandmother, and she has memories of her. Would you be willing to come to Charleston again?" Rebecca immediately booked a flight. 3 days later, she sat in Patricia's living room in a quiet Charleston neighborhood, surrounded by 3 generations of Rose Freeman's descendants. Patricia's mother, Eleanor, sat in a comfortable chair, her hands resting on a cane, her eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. "Tell us everything," Eleanor said. "Tell us about the photograph and what they did to our grandmother." Rebecca spread out copies of the photograph, the enhanced images showing Rose's hand and ring, the documents from the Whitmore estate, and the letters revealing Charles Whitmore's deliberate act of humiliation. She explained what she had learned about the household discipline that had forced Rose to kneel behind the chair. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression hardening as Rebecca described the circumstances of the photograph. When Rebecca finished, Eleanor sat quietly for a moment, then began to speak. "My grandmother Rose never talked much about her time with white families. She said those years were behind her, and she didn't want to give them any more of her life than they'd already taken. But there were things she told my mother and things my mother told me. Eleanor's daughter brought her a glass of water, and she took a sip before continuing. Grandma Rose said that white people in those days had 1,000 ways of reminding you that you were nothing to them. It wasn't just the work or the low wages. It was the constant humiliation, the way they would test you, push you, see how much you would accept before you broke. She told my mother about a photograph, Eleanor continued. She said it was the worst day of her life after freedom came. Worse than the beatings, worse than the insults, worse than the stealing of her wages. Because with the photograph, they made her disappear. They made her invisible while still forcing her to be there, to be part of their display of respectability. She said she felt like a ghost, like she didn't exist as a person. Rebecca felt tears pricking her eyes. Did she say why they punished her that way? Eleanor nodded. She had told the mistress that she wouldn't redo work that had already been done properly. The woman wanted to make her scrub floors that were already clean, wanted to watch her on her knees. Grandma Rose refused. She said, "I'll work hard for you, but I won't pretend dirt is clean and clean is dirty just so you can feel powerful." That's when the master decided to teach her a lesson. After the photograph, she stayed with that family for a few more months, saving every penny she could. Then she left in the night, walked away with just her clothes and her grandmother's ring. She said that ring was the only thing that kept her sane during those years. It reminded her that she came from people who had survived worse, who had crossed an ocean in chains and still maintained their humanity. Patricia spoke up. "Mama, should we show her?" Eleanor nodded. Patricia left the room and returned carrying a small wooden box. She opened it carefully and lifted out a ring. Even before she handed it to Rebecca, Rebecca could see that it was the same ring from the photograph. The silver had darkened with age, but the engravings were still clear. Dr. Mitchell had been right. The symbols were Akan Adinkra. Rebecca could make out several distinct patterns. Sankofa, the symbol of learning from the past, Dweniman, representing humility and strength, and others whose meanings she would need to research more carefully. "My mother wears this on special occasions," Patricia said. "Family gatherings, graduations, weddings. We all know its history. We know it came from Africa with our ancestor. It was worn through slavery, through freedom, through Jim Crow. It survived everything." Eleanor reached out and Patricia placed the ring in her palm. The old woman held it gently, turning it to catch the light. "This ring has seen so much suffering," she said softly, "but it's also seen so much strength. My grandmother wore it when she walked away from that house. She wore it when she married my grandfather. She wore it when she bought her own home. She wore it when her children graduated from school. This ring isn't about what was done to us. It's about what we survived." 2 months later, the Boston Historical Society hosted a special exhibition titled Invisible Labor, Reconsidering Victorian Family Portraits. The centerpiece was the Whitmore family photograph, displayed with extensive contextual material explaining Rose Freeman's story. Rebecca had worked closely with Patricia and Eleanor to ensure Rose's story was told with dignity and accuracy. The exhibition included the enhanced images showing Rose's hand and ring, copies of the documents revealing the deliberate nature of her humiliation, census records tracing her later life, and photographs of the ring itself, which the Freeman family had agreed to loan for the exhibition. But most powerfully, the exhibition included Eleanor's recorded testimony, playing on a loop in the gallery. Visitors could hear Rose's great-granddaughter speaking about the photograph's meaning, about the cruelty of forcing someone into invisibility, and about the strength required to survive such dehumanization. On opening night, Patricia and Eleanor stood before the photograph, surrounded by reporters, scholars, and community members. Rebecca had invited descendants of other Charleston families, both black and white, hoping to create a space for honest conversation about the city's history and the ways that photographs had been used to document, enforce, and sometimes challenge racial hierarchies. A reporter asked Eleanor, "How does it feel to see your grandmother's story finally told?" Eleanor looked at the photograph for a long moment before responding. "It feels like she's finally being seen. For 125 years, people looked at this photograph and saw only the Whitmore family. They saw wealth, respectability, Southern gentility. They didn't see my grandmother forced to kneel behind that chair. They didn't see her strength, her dignity, her refusal to be completely erased. Now they will." Patricia added, "This photograph was meant to humiliate my great-grandmother, to remind her of her place in the white supremacist order. But it failed, because she kept that ring, kept her dignity, built a life and a family. We're here, 4 generations later, telling her story. That's her victory." The exhibition traveled to Charleston, where it was displayed at the city's African American History Museum. The response was overwhelming. Many Charleston residents, both black and white, came forward with their own family photographs and stories, revealing hidden figures, unnamed servants, and the complex relationships between families across the color line. One white Charleston resident, a descendant of another prominent merchant family, brought in a photograph from 1895. Under close examination, it revealed a similar hidden presence, a black woman's foot visible at the edge of the frame, suggesting someone kneeling or sitting just outside the formal composition. "I never noticed this before," the woman said, her voice shaking. "I've had this photograph my whole life, and I never looked closely enough. Who was she? What was her name? What did my ancestors do to her?" These were painful questions, but necessary ones. The exhibition had opened a door to more honest examinations of Southern history, to recognition that the grand photographs of wealthy white families were built on foundations of black labor and suffering that had been deliberately rendered invisible. For Rebecca, the project had become about more than just one photograph or one woman's story. It was about the importance of looking closely, of questioning comfortable narratives, of insisting that every person's humanity be recognized and honored. As the exhibition concluded its run, the Freeman family decided to donate Rose's ring to the Charleston Museum's permanent collection, where it would be displayed alongside her story. Patricia explained the decision. "This ring kept my great-grandmother strong. Now it can do the same for others, remind them that our ancestors survived, that they maintained their dignity and identity even when powerful people tried to take everything from them." Eleanor, now 92, attended the donation ceremony. Standing before a crowd of family, scholars, and community members, she said, "My grandmother Rose wore this ring when she was forced to kneel behind a white man's chair. She wore it when she walked away from that house. She wore it through 60 more years of life, through joy and sorrow, through struggle and triumph. This ring is a witness to history, not the sanitized history that gets told in textbooks, but the real history, with all its cruelty and all its courage." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, during which many in the audience looked at the photograph of Rose's hand, at the ring visible on her finger, and contemplated all the stories still hidden in old photographs, waiting to be discovered and told. Rose Freeman had been forced into invisibility, but through her descendants' determination and Rebecca's careful research, she had been brought into the light. Her story would not be forgotten. The ring she had fought to keep, the symbol of her heritage and resistance, would continue to testify to her strength for generations to come.